Hello and welcome to another World War II podcast. In this episode I'm joined by Jonathan Trigg and we're looking at the Flemish Waffen SS. Within a year of Belgium falling to the Germans in 1940, Belgian citizens were volunteering to join the SS to fight communism on the newly formed Eastern Front. Thousands volunteered and they suffered very heavy casualties. Jonathan, in his new book, Voices of the Flemish Waffen SS, has been gathering the stories of these men and women. And what remarkable stories they are. I devoured the book in just 2 evenings. I found it super interesting. But before we kick off, don't forget, the World War II podcast is made possible through the support of listeners like yourself. $1 or so each month from you helps me to put aside the time to put the show together. If you would like to become a patron, you can join the merry band at patreon.com/WW2podcast. And as a thank you to patrons, I do make available extras. If you're not already a patron, you might find this helps sate your lust for more World War II listening. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast, or head over to the website www.podcast.com to see how you can help support the podcast. And I thank those loyal listeners who already support the show. Right, so let's get cracking. Jonathan, thanks for joining me. So I thought we should perhaps start by looking at Belgium itself, because Belgians are not just Belgians.
Yes, indeed. It's like if Scotland was the same size as England, population-wise, pretty much. You know, how would we feel and how would we interact? That's how I look at it. You know, Belgium is a construct of the days of, you know, European power politics following, you know, Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna and all this type of stuff. It was, you know, put together for the reason of political chess. As the map of Europe often was for so long, not because these two incredibly separate peoples, you know, the Walloons to the south and the Dutch-speaking Flemish to the north, had a huge urge to combine in a union born out of love and respect. There was none of that whatsoever. It was, you know, politicians, lots of them being British and Austrian, saying, right, we'll lump these two areas together and keep it as a buffer state, and to top it all off, we'll put a German in as king. At the time, I'm sure it made absolute sense. As time went on, you know, a century later, and the First World War kicked off, and as usual, Flanders and Belgium seems to be a place where all the other countries think it's a good idea to fight. The stresses and strains of that union really started to show through, and we're still living with that now. Walloons and the Flemish are not a happy union overall.
Had there been a movement in the pre-war times for, you know, like Flemish nationals, or maybe a right-wing Flemish party, or even Walloons? You know, was there a kind of, when the Germans came in and took over in 40? You know, was there a foundation for sort of Flemish nationalism?
The main movement was led by a guy called Staff de Klerk for short. The Flemish National Verbond, so that was the VNV short, and they were a very, very large party. So they weren't, you know, the largest party in Belgium. However, they were most definitely a mass movement, and they had an intellectual base as well as a popular base. They were involved in all levels of politics. They were fairly right-wing, and when I say fairly right-wing, it's you know, they weren't clearly akin to any kind of mainstream political parties we would see now. There was, without doubt, a strong strain of anti-Semitism within the party, and, you know, clearly a strong strain of anti-communism. Of course, that's disappeared from the European scene to a great extent. But they were, you know, what we would class now as Marine Le Pen's National Front, but more to the right. But again, as with that, they had an awful lot of popular support, and it was drawn from years of resentment. So, you know, the party's foundations were based back in the First World War, when Flemish was not considered an official language in the country, particularly in the army. The entire officer corps was more or less Walloon, French-speaking, and the Flemish made up a large percentage of the private soldiery, and didn't even understand the orders that they were given in a language that they didn't comprehend. And then, in effect, as far as their home and kin were concerned, were taken to slaughter by people who didn't see them as equals. And that sense of injustice and that resentment really was the foundation upon which the movement was built. And looking back in history, going hundreds of years back, Flanders always had an independence and, its own, not monarchy, but aristocracy. It was all the way back to William the Conqueror brought over Flemish mercenaries. Hastings in 1066, they were well known even at that stage. And so most definitely for Flanders and to the south, it wasn't as great. The leader there was a guy called Leon de Grael, who later became kind of the poster child for the non-German volunteer movement during the Second World War. And he was a bit of a firebrand, propagandist and demagogue, but also a very, very religious man. So a diehard Catholic. That's what he held in common with the Flemings to the north. And his party, which was the Rex Party, he wanted them to have control of the whole of Wallonia and all the way down into northern France. His issue was then after 40, he wanted, as with all the movements, but Quisling's NS in Norway and Clausen's NSDAP in Denmark, they thought the Germans would give them political power in their own right, but the Germans had other ideas.
Why did the Germans decide to recruit, the Flemish into the SS? Presuming they were recruiting other nationalities at the same time, or were the Flemish the first to go? But why did they feel they needed to have... because one kind of... perhaps the image is that they're all pure Aryan, beautiful blonde-haired, blue-eyed Germans in the SS, but clearly they're not there. They were sucking people up from other nationalities. But why did the Germans feel the need to recruit these other nationalities into the SS?
The answer is through blood and soil, and that was a Nazi creed whereby, yes, the Germans themselves were, without doubt, the wellspring of the Aryan superhuman, the Herrenvolk, as they called them. But they didn't consider that the Aryans potentially stopped at the borders of Germany. They saw that other nationalities were part of the master race. And of course, the Scandinavians fit that mold, Vikings and blonde-haired and blue-eyed tall warriors, etc. So Norwegians and Danes and Swedes, and all fitted that mold. The Dutch, they considered to be, again, a Germanic folk, the successors to German tribes who'd gone over the Rhine, and Dutch is got a lot of similarities linguistically to German, and therefore the Flemish were included in that as well, because as far as the Nazis were concerned, the Flemish and Dutch were pretty much all the same people, and of course Swiss-speaking Germans were part of that as well, and so that's how they saw it all, and even indeed the English, Anglo-Saxons. So they say, Anglo-Saxons, great. They were two Germanic tribes, just happened to get in boats and go over to England. But funny enough, they kind of looked at the Scottish and the Welsh and the Irish and went, no, they're Celts, they're different. They don't get included. That's very much how they saw it. And what they wanted to do was in their, the Nazi New World Order that would come into play once that they'd successfully won the war, is that they would exterminate vast swathes of what they regarded as inferior humanity, the Jews, the Slavs, and so on, and repopulate these vast areas that they would then have, they would then conquer with this multinational blood tribe, as they saw it. So they saw no difference between a Norwegian to a German to an Englishman to a a Fleming to a Dutch. They saw them all together, and that's what they wanted to do, to bring them all together. In terms of, they saw it out, they had to bring that blood group together in order to fight the race war that they thought was the absolute epitome of where humanity was travelling. So whereas Marx viewed history as a struggle between classes, the Nazis viewed world history as a struggle between races. And the only way that they would win is if they brought all of the Aryan race, wherever it may be, all together under one banner. And that was the SS. And so they wanted to bring people together. And so at first, they weren't interested in huge numbers because they thought they were winning. So it was, actually, we don't need to recruit 50,000 Dutch and 30,000 Norwegians and 50,000 Flemings and whatever to make up the gaps in our own ranks, because we're winning the war and it'll all be over very soon. And, we don't need that, but we'll have some, and they will in effect be the leaders of the future. So we'll pick the absolute cream, pick the crop, and those we will train. We will give experience at the front, and they will become their people's future leaders in this happy Nazi SS future.
Was it difficult for them to find volunteers? What motivated these guys that came forward?
It was surprisingly easy, really. I mean, they were moderately successful after their invasions of Belgium and Holland and the Scandinavian countries and so on. But what really tipped it was obviously the advent of Barbarossa. Anti-communism was a hugely powerful motivator for so much of European youth at the time. And that's a very difficult thing to get over nowadays, when the vestiges of communism are, North Korea and China, although the Chinese obviously, try their best not to talk about being communist very often. We don't see it in the same way, without a doubt. And so, we have an inability to understand how powerful anti-communism was as a motivator. And of course, as soon as that happened, and it really did tip the scales, and thousands of young men came forward. I mean, if you think about the Danes, for instance, the Danish armed forces at the outbreak of the Second World War were 6,500 strong. That's their total armed forces. And over 6,000 Danes served in the Waffen SS during the Second World War. And a lot more volunteered, but didn't pass the selection. So that is, in a British context, if you look at it with our armed forces, that will be saying that over 100,000 Brits stepped forward to volunteer. And that's when you start to look at it and go, wow, that is really, really significant. And they made a contribution, but in the scale of things, when 3.5 million was the size of the invasion force that hit the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, a drop in the ocean isn't the right way to look at it, but it gives it some context.
These foreign, obviously they are foreign. Foreign legions. Obviously they're not French, but they're foreign SS legions. So the Flemish is the SS Legion Flandern. They're allowed to fight. They fight together, presumably as one large body. They're not all broken up and disseminated throughout the SS.
The way that Nazi Germany worked, Angus, and that is that the German efficiency and order and so on, in a lot of ways, is a bit of a myth. Is they tended to be quite haphazard in a lot of what they did. So initially, the Germans formed these so-called national legions, and that's how they attracted volunteers. So a lot of those first volunteers thought that they would be joining, in essence, the nucleus of a future army for their nation. So Norwegians, it was the Legio Norwegian. The Danes, it was the Freikorps Denmark. And yes, it was the Legion Flandern for the Flemish. And they felt, we'll join this force and we'll be badged as a Flemish force or a Danish force or whatever. And then when the time is right, we'll become the new army. And they were very shocked A lot of those volunteers, when they were told, right, here you go, here's a German uniform, an SS uniform that you've got to put on. They were going, hang on a sec, why aren't I in a Flemish uniform, Flemish officers and Flemish insignia and Flemish flags and so on. That's what we want to do. And they were told, no, that's not going to happen. And that's where the majority of volunteers were channeled. But at the same time, if you as a volunteer, Flemish volunteer, went into a German recruiting office and said, well, I want to join the SS Viking division, for instance, chances are you would have been accepted for that. And then as a Flemish trooper, you'd have ended up in the Viking division, which had multinational elements as well, or you might even have ended up in the Leibstandarte in Hitler's bodyguard division, or the Reich division, or whatever it was. Is that it was without a doubt an element of chaos, around it all, and there always was throughout the war. It's just the way that the Germans tended to operate. But the National Legion concept died in 1942, when really that section of volunteers started to choke off. But more importantly, the Germans, realised the war wasn't won, the Soviet Union wasn't going to disappear anytime soon, and that they needed bigger units to fight. Because the issue was the attrition on the Eastern Front was so great. These relatively small units of 1,000, 1,200 men, that type of thing, would go there and in a relatively short period of time would be worn down to just a point where they were combat ineffective. So the Germans had to rethink and said, we need bigger units. It went to assault brigades in the end, Sturmbrigaden as they called them, that were 5,000 strong. And they said, these units are the only ones that we can actually use that would last any time at the front. And even they didn't last that long. Again, casualty rates were so high. And that's when they started to shift to full-scale divisions, such as the Nordland and what have you. But by that stage, the number of volunteers coming forward was nowhere near as great. So in a lot of the so-called foreign divisions towards the end of the war, the majority of troops were either native Germans, Reich Germans as they were called, from the 1938 borders, or ethnic Germans, Volksdeutsche, from all over Europe.
I made a note that is it Krasny Bor in 1943? They were left with 45 uninjured and 400 killed and wounded, which is incredible.
It was horrific, and then you kind of look at Krasny Bor in the kind of the panoply of battles on the Eastern Front, and it barely rates a mention. In general histories of what went on the Eastern Front, because as a battle, it had a little bit of size, it had some significance, but in comparison to a Stalingrad or a Kursk or a Kharkov or an Uman or whatever, or Kiev, it doesn't even rate. But for the guys who were there, it was utterly traumatic, and it was a defining battle. And again, when I was interviewing them and taking them through Krasny Bor and so on, that they would, half the time you would get this far away look and you'd be going, in their mind, they're there. They're absolutely there. And it was, yes, it was, fascinating to go through, and fascinating to meet people who survived. I mean, when I interviewed Dries Koolens, who obviously lives in Metzingen down in Germany now, Flemish volunteer who served throughout the war, he just mentioned over coffee that he'd fought at Narva. And of course, there was a guy who was a survivor of a very small number of Flemish soldiers actually survived Narva. It really, really was just utterly horrific. And barely 500 of them went in the first place. So to actually be sitting there opposite a guy who was in that battle and who's still alive today was a real eye-opener.
I do wonder, because presumably by this time, certainly by 1943, at home, the conditions at home, it's clearly not the land of milk and honey is the land that they've left, that in theory they are fighting for. In Belgium, there'll be people being moved out for forced labour into Germany. There'll be rationing. It must have been. I mean, could they even still get, as the war went on, recruits to refill the ranks of these national legions?
They did indeed. It was kind of went in cycles. Obviously, they had initial rush, following the invasion and the call for volunteers, and then the big wave following the invasion of the Soviet Union, and then a kind of a fairly steady stream from then onwards. But as the war turned, and a lot of the veterans mentioned this, that the news of Stalingrad made a real difference. And, the difference it made was that, those who were kind of wavering, shall I join, shall I not? The majority just went, no, I can smell the wind. It's going against the Germans. I'm going to keep my hands in my pockets, keep my head down and do what I'm doing. But for a minority, it actually made them say, right, do I believe what I say I believe? And if I do, I need to get off my backside and do something about it. So funny enough, the tide turning against the Nazis became a bit of a spur for quite a number to join, which, can be quite a difficult concept to get your head around.
It's counterintuitive, isn't it?
Yeah, it is to say, I think we're going to lose, so I'm going to join. But then there's always been a strain of that in the military mind. I mean, I remember reading about, Dien Bien Phu in 54, and the fact that even when it became absolutely clear that the Viet Minh were going to beat the French there were large numbers of volunteers from the Legion or what have you to be parachuted in to a place they knew that they were not going to get out of. I think there's always been an element of that in the military and the quasi-military mind. But it did mean that there was a general tapering off of volunteers until the last big wave was after Belgium was liberated. And of course, what happened, it's easy to imagine. Western allies are getting close. And all of those who thought that my goodness, once they're liberated, I'm not going to be very popular around here. Then they all cleared off it happened in Holland as well as Belgium and France, and so on. So thousands of people, whole families with all their possessions that they could get hold of, moved into Germany to prepared areas and prepared camps, and so on. And of course, they're all sitting there. And it's, well, what do we do now? And that's when, again, large numbers kind of either put their hand up voluntarily and said, yeah, let's join, or were, had those arms twisted to join because it was like, well, you're committed now, so you might as well pick up a rifle, put on a helmet and get to the front.
How are they viewed in Belgium? I mean, it must have changed as the war went on, but how are they viewed when they joined up in sort of 1940?
You're absolutely right on that central point, Angus. It definitely changed as the war went on, particularly as liberation started to become a reality. But initially, the population was pretty much split. In Flanders, very large sections of the population, be they, BNV, Flemish independence supporters or not, were actually in favour. They saw no problem with it. There was a lot of indifference as well, going, well, I understand, but if they want to do that, that's what they want to do. But there were, without doubt, elements that were hostile to it. But, it was nothing more than kind of dirty looks in the street, maybe throwing a bit of food at them passing by type of thing, if that. There was very little in terms of, organised resistance or, what we would regard as programs of targeted assassinations and so on. That did start to take off, later in the war, but again, was never of a huge scale. One volunteer I interviewed from Holland, Jan Monk, who said, he was shot at as he tried to cross a bridge on his bicycle in his uniform, but the guy missed and, he just fired back from his pistol a few times, and that was that. And they all parted and disappeared and never spoke anything again. And it was very much the same for the Flemings. they sometimes found, came across people friends, neighbours, who wouldn't talk to them because of what they'd done. But it was not a mass, feeling of revulsion and contempt towards them, without a doubt, until, of course, liberation appeared, and then, needless to say, everyone was a member of the resistance.
Well, I did find it interesting that the VNV, the political party that supported them going, at some point in the war, actually decides it's not a great thing for them to volunteer and suggests that the volunteers actually go into non-combatant roles. And I thought that was an interesting switch on of policy from, in theory, the party that's the closest to the German Nazi party.
Very much so, and a lot of it hinged around the change in leadership. So when Staff de Klerk died in 1942 of a heart attack, that was a real game changer for the VNV, because the guy that took over, Hendrik Elias, was a different character. He was more moderate than de Klerk was, and had real doubts about the alignment of the VNV with the Nazis. He felt that there were going to be real issues about that, in particular in getting the Nazis to agree to the VNV's ultimate goal of an independent Flanders. In all his dealings with the Nazis, he felt quite strongly that was not the direction that they were going to take at the end of the war, if they won. And at the same time, that coincided with particularly actually Himmler's promotion of the devoured group led by Jeff van der Wiele. And, van der Wiele was a committed Nazi. So, if the VNV were a fairly mass far-right movement, devoured was an extreme right Nazi movement, very much on the fringes and with nothing like the mass membership of the VNV. But, by their extremist rhetoric and actions, they garnered publicity and caught the Germans' eye. And of course, devoured's position was that actually Flanders should be broken off of Belgium and become a part of Germany, become another German region, as Saxony or Thuringia or Bavaria and what have you. Flanders would just be another one of those. And of course, that was the antithesis to the VNV, so no, we want an independent country. And of course, for Himmler and so on, van der Wiele's work was that's quite interesting. We quite like that idea. That's where we want to go anyway. And so there started to become some real conflict within the Flemish nationalist movement. That has always has echoes in far right and far left movements across Europe for decades. Is that these groups tend to argue among themselves and splinter and reform and splinter again and beat each other up and goodness knows what else.
It does make you wonder how those guys already in the field must have felt when the party that initially called for them to go up changes its mind, and they realise that they're no longer necessarily fighting for the people that suggested that they were called up. They must have felt, I don't know, a bit of a loose end in that respect.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, they'd also started to lose, well, they had lost to a large degree, most of their leadership that they had before. Obviously, de Klerk had died, as I've said. The other big influence of them was Raymond Polonera, who was the head of propaganda for the VNV prior to the war. He was a lot younger than de Klerk and very much, had that kind of firebrand, youthful, very, very charismatic figure. He was killed relatively early at the front, having been the first batch of volunteers, and that did leave the volunteers somewhat rudderless. And they did feel, without a doubt, that there was a growing sense of detachment from what was happening at home with the politics of it all. Because, as always, you're thousands of miles away at the front and whatever, is that you become wrapped up in the men around you and your unit and your comrades, and that's what it is. So that initial kind of, we're here as the soldiers of the VNV just disappeared after a while to well, not disappeared completely, but began to fade and be replaced by, actually, I'm a soldier in the Legion Flandern, or, I'm Sturmbrigade, Langmark or whatever, and I'm here with my comrades fighting, the Bolsheviks and trying to survive.
Once they're homogenised into the SS, they're not, it's almost as if they're no longer have got any connection with their, where they're from. Once their own local legions have been wound up.
Over time, funnily enough, the changes became kind of more national, if I can put it like that. So when they started, in particular, their officer and NCO corps were almost, exclusively German. And all orders were given in German and so on. And they felt, hang on a sec, we're just not the cannon fodder per se, but the private soldiery being ordered around by these people who don't speak our language and who don't really understand us. So their connection back home to the V&V and what have you is very strong. But as the war goes on, a lot of those initial characters, if they survive the first few battles, become the NCOs, become the officers. And all of a sudden the language of command suddenly becomes Flemish. And they feel more Flemish national in that regard. But at the same time, that link to home, to the V&V, becomes weaker and weaker as they become, far more committed to what's going on in the front and, just being part of that kind of battle cycle.
Did they ever fight in the West? Were they ever even called upon to fight in the West?
No, the Flemish weren't. There were stirrings. That's probably a bit of a weird articulation, but there were stirrings of it about the time of the Ardennes offensive, Battle of the Bulge. And of course, the idea being on the German side that they would, in effect, advance to Antwerp. So they would go back into Belgium, back into Flanders. And so what they did do was they started to draw some recruits from the exiles who'd been displaced following, Belgium's liberation into not units that were looking to fight, but if you like, almost administrative units and propaganda units who were meant to follow the successful offensive to go back into Flanders and, if you like, begin the occupation again, root out those who collaborated with the Anglo-Americans and so on. And that obviously came to nothing. But the Flemish Waffen SS volunteers themselves were exclusively used on the Eastern Front, and then that was very much where they wanted to be. They never saw themselves as having any problems with the English or British or the Americans. And Albert Albrecht's story is a classic example of that. So his best civilian friend before he joined up, who was going to join with him, had to do some stuff with the family business, and during that process helped a couple of downed RAF crewmen, and told Albert this and so on. Said, right, I'm going to help them escape because I've got no problem with the British, as you don't, Albert. You were born there and so on. So I'm going to help these guys get home, and then I'm going to join the Waffen SS. So this guy, in his mind, he didn't have a problem with, on the one hand, I'm going to help downed British airmen escape back home, and then the next day put on a Waffen SS uniform. But of course, as it turned out, he was informed on, taken, he was arrested, and the next thing you knew, he'd been shot. I mean, Albert was going to write a letter, an official, well, not an official letter per se, but a letter from himself as a Waffen SS volunteer, to try and get his friend saved from the firing squad. He was advised very strongly by his immediate superior not to do so, as it would affect his own position and could put him in danger. He could be seen as perhaps being in the same boat, but he never forgave himself for it. Now, one of the things when I interviewed him that came across very strongly is that of all the things that went on, that the guilt he felt for not helping save his friend's life has permeated his entire life. Without a shadow of a doubt. He was coming out of Brussels main railway station and saw his friend's father wearing black, and knew immediately that therefore his friend was dead and the father was in mourning. And he almost ran. He just needed to find an exit where he didn't have to face this guy, because there he was in Waffen SS uniform when he knew his this guy's son had been executed. And I mean, it's strange. One of the things that Albert did in later life, he retired. He ran a successful tour bus company, founded it and ran it for many years. And then he retired. And the town he retired to, he realised, well, he lived in and then retired in, didn't have a sports stadium. So he single-handedly, over a period of 10 years, he would go there every day. He got the council to agree, land just on the edge of the town. And he built, single-handedly and paid for, a 10,000-seat outdoor stadium. And it was in the newspapers again and again. Absolutely unbelievable. This guy would literally just walk to this place every morning for 8:30 and start mixing concrete. And that's what he do. And every day, moving, it's incredible. And the stadium is still there. It's used by the town. 10,000-seat stadium. He built it. I mean, it's crazy. But
incredible.
You can see the genesis of that is guilt.
Yeah. So at the end of the war, presumably, then they're all in. These volunteers are all in Germany if they're fighting on the Eastern Front. I mean, what do they do at the end? Do they come home? Do they go into hiding? I mean, would they even know if they were welcomed at home? I mean, what do the Allies? How did the Allies treat these people? Did they want them to go back to where they were from, or
first and foremost, they're all in Germany, and they knew they had to avoid being captured by the Russians, the Soviets, by any means imaginable. They had no illusions what would happen to them if they fell into Soviet hands. They weren't going to be shot immediately. That they end up in Siberia, in the gulags forever and a day. We're very lucky to get back alive. So they were desperate to get over to the Anglo-American side. Most of them thought, right, if we get over that side, we'll just surrender. They'll send us home, and hopefully, fingers crossed, it would be all right. Although they knew that the reception they get at home would probably be pretty bad, but they didn't consider that their lives would be in danger. And they also didn't really understand what form punishment that they would receive would take. I think that they genuinely underestimated, what a reconstituted Belgian government was going to have in store for them. Not all went home. I mean, one of the guys I interviewed, Oswald van Utigem, he decided, actually, I think Oswald was probably, perhaps a little more savvy than a lot of the others. And so he stayed in Germany, went to the Black Forest. He took on a German name and worked there and married a German girl and so on, and pretty much stayed there after the war because he considered, if I go home, chances are that, retribution will come my way. And the majority, that's what happened. So they managed to surrender to the Anglo-American forces over a period of time. They were kind of passed down the line, if you like, back to Belgium, where they were given over to the hands of the local authorities, who put them through a very a very quick and summary process, where they were pretty much to a one charged with taking up arms against the Belgian state, which they felt very, very aggrieved about, because they felt very firmly that's not what they did. That they never took up arms against Belgium. They never took arms against their own countrymen. They took up arms to fight the communists and for, an independent Flanders and so on. So they felt that the basis for which they were being, tried and convicted was entirely wrong. And they were all sentenced. It was usually about 3 years, depending on what they'd done and so on. But, 3-4 years was about the norm in terms of prison. And then had their civil rights taken for usually a period of about 10 years, that they couldn't vote. A lot of them had to, consistently appear in front of the local police stations. So, a bit like being on parole. And that's the process they went through. But, it was all of the kind of the non-judicial aspects which really hit home to them in a lot of ways. So finding a job was nigh on impossible. Because as soon as a would-be employer found out, about their service and record, that was it. They were struck off the list, and hence why Theo Doosterlink, who was the guy I said never told his family, that's why he never told them. He was a sign writer, and he went to work for a firm who did a lot of contracting work for the Belgian military. And so he said, well, I can't tell anyone, because otherwise I'll lose my job. And I like my job, so I need to feed my family. So that's what I'm going to do. So that was the basis of his own secret. As for Oswald, he was all prepared to head to Argentina, quit Europe for good, and take that route. And his mother persuaded him to come home, and he went home, arrested, and ended up in the same cell as his father. Where, funny enough, his father, who was an architect, was imprisoned with an architect and also a senior member of the VNV, formed an unofficial, really, kind of architects firm with a bunch of other imprisoned architects who were ex-VNV men. And that's where, Oswald got his own training as an architect. And they ended up winning the contracts to design half of the reconstituted state buildings in Ghent and so on. So local police headquarters and all this type of thing were designed by imprisoned VNV architects. No sense of irony, clearly. But, it was, some were executed. Again, it tended to be happenstance more than anything else. I think it's difficult for us all to imagine the chaos that was reigning in places such as Belgium at the end of the war, and how much had been, destroyed and how much was disjointed and disorganised. And in that kind of first flush of, revenge and what have you, if you got caught up within that as a returning Flemish Waffen SS volunteer, then you could have had a very, very rough time indeed. Oswald was probably a lot cleverer than most, and when he got back, it had really, the heat had gone out of it. So, he did his time, and he didn't even serve the whole of his conviction time, and he was out.
Yeah, did they stay? It's a small band of brothers. Did they all stay in contact with one another, or were they quite happily left, never to see one another again?
Real mix. A lot of them, they absolutely got in contact again, and they did it on a self-help basis, because it was how am I going to get a job? And it was, well, okay, I'm an ex volunteer. I've got my own small business for people. I'm going to recruit. I need to recruit someone. I'll recruit another ex-volunteer because I know how hard they work, and I'll give them a job, and no one else will. And they looked after each other's families, and they formed these groups. And the police were constantly on the lookout for this sort of group, in terms of their concern was that they would form the nucleus of new cells of extremists that could get involved in violence, because these were, after all, men with a lot of military training and experience. So they tended to see them in a very negative light, and would break them up, and then they'd reform under another name, etc., etc. And that's what a lot of them did. And indeed, the first kind of grouping, the main grouping of volunteers I met, was called Snason's Group, based in Ghent, and they'd been together for years and years and years. And are very much, knew each other's families, and they were, godparents to each other's children and all that type of thing. But equally, there were some who just disappeared into woodwork. So, Theo Deuslink, classic example, he kept it all secret, never told anyone. He went to kind of one reunion in the 60s and never met anyone from his company. And that was because he found out, in effect, they'd all been killed. In his mind, he was kind of, I've got very little connection to this wider group, because all the people I serve with are gone. So it was only kind of years later, retired and so on, that he was kind of, well, I'm going to give this another go, because I feel that there is a link, and I do want to kind of re-establish it. And he had, and was very, very happy. And there were some more who did, that came out of the woodwork and kind of reintegrated themselves in it. But without a doubt, some decided that that's it. I've done my bit, and I want out, and never want anything more to do with it. But the majority, it was we've got to help each other, because no one else will.
How do they now view their war service all these years later, those few surviving guys?
The overriding feeling with and it came through and I asked there were serious questions that I asked every single volunteer, kind of set questions. And then, much as, on a podcast like this, it then dependent on where that conversation took us, and so on, that I added other things. But at the same time, there was a spine of questions that I asked everyone. And I asked that, and the answer every single time was that none of them, indeed none of the volunteers I've ever interviewed, said they felt any regret whatsoever. None of them. So even Albrecht, who, as I said before, carries a mountain of guilt on his shoulders, stated without a shadow of a doubt, I have absolutely no regrets about my service. Lucy Lefevre, who served with the German Red Cross as a nurse and so on, was gang raped at the end of the war by Red Army soldiers. She's turned out as a woman in her 90s, and hearing that from a woman in her 90s, well, hearing that from any woman is actually horrific, but a woman in her 90s, it takes it to another level. No regrets at all. And they did what they did, and that was that. And actually, the majority of them look back on their time and their service as the defining time and experience of their life. One of the things that struck me was that these people they're in their 90s, and they have spent far more time retired or married with kids and what have you than they ever did as Waffen SS volunteers. That period of time was really short. I mean, for some of them, it was 2 years less. And so a tiny amount of time, but it was the defining time period of their entire life. And it has seeped into everything that they have ever done, then or since. And that's, I still find that incredible.
Well, I sort of thought that, but you can sort of understand why it's so defining, because they took part in some of the most horrific actions on the Eastern Front.
Without, I think, it's that experience marked them in ways that perhaps it's difficult for people nowadays to understand. I mean, I served myself, of course, and I didn't have to do anything as difficult or horrendous as our recent conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I've had friends, in my regiment who've done that and so on. But I died in Northern Ireland and Bosnia and what have you. And I remember that as, I mean, looking back on it, could I say, well, that wasn't the defining part of my life? Actually, it probably was. And maybe there's an element of, it's that time in your life. It's in your early 20s when you're really forming your character and your view of the world and so on. So maybe there's an element of that and so on anyway. But it's also about the level of experience.
Camaraderie, even.
Without a doubt. And of course, if that's what I'm thinking about, when I was in a very, very different conflict in Northern Ireland or what have you, didn't have tanks and airstrikes, massed artillery and all that type of thing. What would something of that scale and barbarity, how would that impact, young men and women as volunteered here? I can only, guess and so on. But again, that's what I've tried to kind of unearth, and that's what I really wanted from those interviews. I didn't want to push the interviewees to talk about the big picture in that way and so on, because you can get that from far better histories. It was what was it like through their eyes at that moment, and what did they see and how did it feel?
Is their story well known in Belgium, or has it kind of been swept under the table?
It's actually pretty well known, as with all these things. Trying to get obviously younger generations interested in what's gone before them is always a bit of a struggle. So I don't think that it's a story that trips off everyone's tongue, in Belgium, even in Flanders. But it's far more well known than, for instance, our own experiences of the British Free Corps or whatever it may be. Partly that's to do with the media in terms of they are quite happy to discuss it in the mainstream media, and they don't have a view that black and white view that all the individuals involved were evil Nazis and so on, and despicable. The independence movement's still very powerful, even more powerful, it can be argued, than it ever was, and so that kind of that affects how they are viewed. So people will discuss them without without kind of fear that they're discussing a racist Nazi ideology or philosophy or what have you. And the fact that people like Oswald van Utegem have been incredibly open about their service, and then gone through elected office. This guy became senator in the Belgian Parliament, standing up and saying, "I served in the Waffen SS during the war." It's not why he was elected per se, but he never hid it. I mean, if you imagine a kind of a mainstream politician here, going for MP for a major party, saying, "Oh, did I mention I used to be in the BNP?" Career death, and quite rightly so. But it is different there. I mean, there's a whole gamut of views and so on, and a very strong opinions, feeling that it was a dark period in Flemish history of those involved. Were Nazis by any other name and are despicable and shouldn't be part of mainstream life. But that's not the overwhelming view, or that's my sense of it. Anyway.
It's sort of quite nice. It's just not swept under the table, because you're kind of almost rewriting history when you, I don't want to say deny it, but when you just sort of turn a blind eye and pretend it didn't happen.
Very much so. I mean, I went over that, and like I mentioned in my acknowledgements in the book, it wasn't my idea. It was my wife's idea. Why don't we go for a long weekend to Bruges, 4 or 5 days, take our daughter, our son was away at the time, take our daughter and we see him and be absolutely lovely. And when it's all organised, I said, that's a great idea. By the way, I might possibly just disappear off here and there to conduct some interviews. Hope that's all right. But we stayed in a lovely kind of B&B in the Alta, and I spoke to the couple who ran it, middle-aged middle-aged pair of guys, very, very nice guys indeed, and they knew about the use frontiers. They'd heard about it, and they weren't, trying to avoid, and they were quite happy. We sat there and had a cup of coffee, because I wanted to get a perspective on, Flemish who weren't involved, who weren't part of the use frontier world and what have you. They were just normal Belgians in that way. And these two guys were very happy and open to discuss it. They said it doesn't really impinge on their life overly much, but yeah, they know elements of the story, and there were quite a few that volunteered and lots to do with the independence movement. And they said it's just part of Flemish life and Belgian life, and they just get on with it. So yes, there was no desire to kind of sweep it under the carpet. Unlike in France, the French have in their historical outlook do not wish at all to consider that there was any element of collaboration during the war. And there's no way that there were thousands of Frenchmen wearing Waffen SS uniforms, fighting all the way to the ruins of Berlin. No. Would never ever happen. I foolishly, the first book I did in the Hitler's Legion series, Hitler's Gauls, was on the French volunteers. And I thought, well, that'll be picked up by a French publisher. No way at all. They have no interest as far as they're concerned. It never happened. They've got anything to do with it, and they have no wish to discuss it.
Well, yeah, I wonder how the Belgian experience differs when you look at all the other national legions, because there's quite a few. I mean, it seems to be quite a pragmatic view that they've taken. The reasons they were fighting are they're not rabid sort of anti-Semitic concentration camp. They have genuine reasons for fighting communism. And I sort of thought when I was reading, they volunteered to fight communism. That's not vastly dissimilar to the swathes of people who went over to Spain to fight either communism or fascism, depending, during the Civil War. There's a sort of a parallel with the Spanish Civil War and what these guys were doing during the Second World War.
I think there are absolute. You've always got to be wary, haven't you, to perhaps go too far down that line and start to draw too many conclusions from it. But at the same time, there are, without doubt, some convergence and thematic approaches that are the same. And you can draw the same with, for instance, Al-Qaeda and ISIS in a modern context, in terms of, supranational ideologies that motivate relatively small numbers, but at the same time, still significant numbers of primarily young men to go and fight for a cause that may not specifically be their own and maybe thousands of miles away. And of course, you can't draw too many conclusions. But at the same time, yeah, without a doubt, it is there. The Flemish were, I think, that issue of their overwhelming motivator being their wish for an independent Flanders puts them in a slightly different box from, say, the Dutch or the Norwegians or the Danes or whatever, because they had their own country already. For them, in terms of the pecking order of why am I doing this, for them, anti-communism would almost certainly be at the top, whereas for the Flemings, it would probably be number two. I think that's the way that they kind of view it behind their wish for independence. But at the same time, yes, you can draw it because maybe it's a feature of the time. I do get the sense that the 30s had a set, maybe it had a lot of echoes of pre-1914 and summer of 1914 in that kind of that burst of idealism, with individuals being motivated in large numbers by ideas and philosophies, and willing to actually carry out some fairly extreme action in order to prove that they believe those ideas. And if that be travelling to Spain and joining an international brigade, or fighting for Franco, or joining the Waffen SS and so on, that's what they did. But yes, and then looking back on it now, it's incredibly easy to judge, in hindsight, and say that was the wrong thing to do. But and again, the what ifs of history, you can get yourself down a right rabbit hole doing that. But what if those units hadn't been part of the SS? So what if the Legion Flandern was in effect a Flemish unit that operated under Flemish colours and what have you? Now there are legal aspects there. Would they be covered by the Geneva Convention and the Hague Convention and so on? And I understand that. But if they'd done that and they hadn't had that SS banner, that SS tag on them, and so on, would they be seen in a very different light now? Because of course, as we started out in our conversation, so we judge so much of it by what happened and the SS empire that ran the concentration camps, that carried out mass exterminations, the Holocaust and so on. That was the SS. So that colours our view. But if they hadn't been part of that, what would we think? Question mark. And again, you can, Alice in Wonderland and that hole on that if you carry on thinking about it. But at the same time, it is perhaps something just to throw into the mix.
Shall we leave it there? Thank you. Jonathan's book is Voices of the Flemish Waffen SS. There is a link on the website if you're looking for something to add to your Christmas list. I would certainly think about putting it on. I don't think you would regret it. So that's it for this episode. Don't forget, in support of each episode, I do post on Facebook bits and pieces in support of each show. So if you want to give me a follow, search for WW2 Podcast and give me a like. It's also a good place for discussion. It's surprising what crops up from time to time from you guys, and it's great to hear from people. So that's it for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.